Well, good evening, everyone. Michael, are we ready? All right. Good evening, everyone. Great to see all of you. Great to be here with you tonight on this Thursday evening in August together for a Faith and Justice Forum. I'm very happy tonight to welcome back Dr. Jennifer Freeman. She is going to be returning also, I think, hopefully in the spring. We've been talking about it together. So if you enjoy tonight, I hope that you'll consider coming back, and our friends online, of course, as well. So Faith and Justice Forums are a thing that we have periodically where we engage big questions from the perspective of faith around politics or things of that type of nature. Tonight, we're going to be actually going back in time and talking a little bit about how early Christians understood the nature of the body, etc., which raises a lot of questions about gender and sex and things of those kinds of nature. So that will be some of what we will engage. I don't want to give too much more away. I want to leave a lot of the powder dry for Jennifer. But without further ado, let me say a quick prayer, and then I'll introduce formally our speaker. So let's pray together. Lord, we thank you for this day, the day that you've given to us, for life and for the freedom to come together, to fellowship, to be with and for one another. We thank you for our friend and teacher tonight, Dr. Jennifer Freeman. We ask and pray that you will bless her and bless her words and be with us and in our midst as we have this important conversation. We ask and pray all these things in your name. Amen. Well, friends, Dr. Jennifer Freeman is the Associate Professor and Program Director of Theology and the Arts at United Theological Seminary of the Twin Cities, where she teaches courses in art history and praxis, as well as historical theology. And I, as a personal aside, I kind of got to know Jennifer because she let me teach one of her classes last summer, which is the history of Christian thought from the early period up to the Reformation, which has been a ton of fun. Her recent publications include The Good Shepherd, Image, Meaning, and Power, and the Ashburnham Pentateuch in its context, the Trinity in Late Antiquity and the Early Middle Ages. She is a widely known and well-regarded medievalist and art historian. This is going to be very exciting tonight. She also has a background in studio art and technical theater and has recently begun training as an iconographer. So perhaps if you have interest in commissioning a piece, you should talk to her. I don't know. But tonight, that's right. Tonight she will be presenting on a conflicted relationship, the body and embodiment in early Christianity. Will you please join me in welcoming Dr. Freeman?
Thank you all for being here, and thank you also to Christian for the invitation. Just going to scooch myself actually a little more together. Good. All right. Well, I'd like to greet you on behalf of United Theological Seminary and also on behalf of my home congregation, Holy Trinity Orthodox Church in St. Paul. But everything I'm saying tonight is my own. I suppose no one bears any responsibility. Greetings and independent presentation. But I'd like to take the opportunity of this invitation from Christian to think together this evening about the body in early Christianity. Basically, the biblical and theological and cultural assumptions and contexts that influenced how early Christians thought about and treated their bodies and the bodies of other people. And I think we'll just have time to maybe gesture towards or think together maybe about the ways the various perspectives have then shaped subsequent Christian thinking about the body and embodiment. So for the structure of our time, I'm going to start with a couple of illustrative, maybe evocative vignettes. And then I'm going to spend a little bit of time just sketching out the context of early Christianity so we're all on the same page in terms of like, what do we mean when we say early Christianity? What are we referring to? And what are some of those elements that are influencing early Christian thought? And then in the last portion, I'm going to turn to a series of I was going to say representative examples, but we can debate how representative they are also. And then kind of segue into conversation from there. So I've provided a handout, which will give a sense of structure, even if there isn't much. So I hope you can grab onto some of that, and it'll be reflected in the PowerPoint as well. Any questions before we get going? And you can hear me okay. Great. And that's not too bad either. All right. Let's get started. In Nicomedia, on a winter day in the year 312, a group of prisoners gathered around a man lying on his back and bound by chains. They stood shoulder to shoulder, creating a kind of phalanx that obscured their companions' actions within the cell. With no access to an altar, and being so thoroughly restrained in his body, the martyr Lucian of Antioch celebrated the Eucharist upon his own chest. Thus, as recorded in Philostorgius's early 5th century church history, quote, "The holy choir that surrounded him, as though he had already died, took the form of a church and shielded the proceedings from impious eyes," end quote. In an entirely different kind of cell in northern Syria, a little over a century later, Theodoret, the bishop of Cyrus, visited his friend Maurus, a 90-year-old hermit who dressed in goat hair and loved to, quote, "make extended discourses on philosophy." Theodoret described his friend Maurus as having desired for a long time to witness a celebration of the spiritual and mystical sacrifice. And so, as he was nearing the end of his life, Maurus asked the bishop for the offering of the divine gift right there in his hermit hut. Theodoret states that he consented gladly and sent for the divine vessels to be brought because the place was not far off, where they were kept. Most strikingly, to me at least, the bishop improvised and used the hands of the attending deacons as an altar upon which to place the chalice and the paten. Theodoret shared this excellent philosophy for imitation, as he calls it, in his religious history as a kind of eulogy for his friend Maurus. In these accounts, the Christian body functions as a liturgical furnishing and architecture. Chest and hands become altars for the mystical body and blood of Christ. A cluster of bodies are likened to the walls of the church. These stories reflect a certain mobility and flexibility of early Christian liturgical practice, particularly when in service to pastoral care and community. While early Christianity is generally regarded as having a suspicion or even an outright rejection of the body and its appetites, numerous stories like these present the human body as a material mediator of the sacred. So the generalization that early Christians and desert hermits and monks in particular practiced extreme discipline and even rejection of the body is not unfounded, however. So there are theological and spiritual treatments of the body as an obstacle, which are addressed in text from the writings of Paul onward, basically. One 5th century history written by a man named Palladius begins by praising the man who commissioned the text, which was treating desert ascetics, so these kind of disciplined monks, we could say. He praises the person for commissioning the text that led him to, quote, "arouse our slothful mind to the contemplation of better things, to imitate and attempt to rival the ascetic virtues of our holy and immortal spiritual fathers, and all who have lived to please God with much mortification of the body," end quote. He praises these ascetics as invincible athletes. The preface is thus representative of the way that ascetics were lauded for their physical and spiritual discipline, and that's the thing we're going to talk about, the relationship between the physical and the spiritual. So, for example, the Vita of the martyr Lucian, who I just mentioned, praised his ascetic practices like fasting, which in fact gave him an advantage when he was later persecuted. So he had been like an athlete, in a sense, training in body and in spirit before that, right? The Christian struggle for perfection was waged on the battlefield of the body. As, for example, the desert monk Abba Alonius declared, quote, "If I had not destroyed myself completely, I should not have been able to rebuild and shape myself again." I think the stories that I began with just now they demonstrate an assumption that the body is good. So despite this kind of, or maybe in conversation with this physical struggle or discipline or athletic training, there is the fact that the body can be used in a liturgical context affirms the goodness of the body. There's another version of the Passion of Lucian, the Martyrdom of Lucian, in which he says, this my chest will be your table, and I do not think that it will be of less value in God's sight than that of lifeless matter. So my chest in this prison cell is as valid and valuable, and maybe more, to God than some cold stone altar, right? So the human body is good, having been made by God and being made in the imago Dei, the image of God. And that's a whole nother presentation that we could barely even talk about here. It's too complicated. So before we turn to some examples, I want to start with this: what is early Christianity business? And what do we mean when we say early Christianity? I wonder, actually, because I didn't ask you before, how much conversation along the way, or should I save conversation for later? Okay, well, then I would like to say, yeah, go ahead.
Are you looking back to the split with the Roman Empire, the Eastern and Western, the Orthodox, and the early Christian founding?
Yeah, what's known as like the Great Schism. So that's in the 11th century. So we're going to go back even earlier, before that. Yeah, so that's good. That's a good place to start, because I was going to say, when you hear the phrase early Christianity, what do you think of? Or when you yourself use it, what do you mean by it? Would be another way of putting that. If there's a couple folks who would volunteer to say. Yeah.
Before the church. Before the church.
Before the church. Okay.
Yeah, first couple hundred years after Christ.
Okay. What's the church? That's another question.
Well, there was no church.
Oh. Mm. So by church, what do you mean?
Well,
We're getting into some big philosophical issues.
Christianity became organized
Organized.
with a hierarchy and the structure that we know so well.
Ah, I see. Okay. All right. Anybody else? Okay. We can continue. Okay, that's great. We'll come to the timeline too. So I would say when I talk about early Christianity, and I'm speaking to you as a kind of pre-modern art historian and historian of Christianity, one way I talk about it is as a kind of loose, and this gets a little bit to your point, I think, a loose, diverse collection of communities and practices that understood themselves to be followers of Jesus. So this was, even from the beginning, in fact, in different ways, liturgical and hierarchical, because early Christianity came out of the Jewish tradition, right? So we know that the Psalms were being sung immediately. We have an early text called the Didache, dates to the 2nd century, and gives a sense of liturgical practice and the celebration of communion in a liturgical kind of context. We know that there were early councils, not ecumenical, but even at the time of the writing of the New Testament text, there's a council mentioned. The first ecumenical council, meaning a council that's meant to be applied universally to the whole church, doesn't happen until the year 325, right? So you might be thinking of, for example, the legalization of Christianity in 313 by the Emperor Constantine, which is not the same thing as making Christianity the official religion of the Roman Empire. That doesn't happen until the end of the 4th century, right? So Christianity was legalized in 313 in the Edict of Milan with other minority religions, right? So it was one among many. It was a kind of religious tolerance edict. Okay, so there's a lot of debate of what is early Christianity, because there's already debate about the nature of the person Jesus and things like this. But in the first couple of hundred years, Christianity is still a persecuted minority religion. So those persecutions are sporadic, not usually programmatic, but there's a couple of really big ones. But they are severe when they happen, and include things like confiscation and destruction of property and people. So when is early Christianity is another related question. And this tends to overlap, at least in academic conversations, with what we would call late antiquity. And that's another very slippery thing, because even in academic text, you're going to see a whole bunch of different date ranges. It depends on discipline, if you're in literature or history or art history. So, and it overlaps with the early Middle Ages and all manner of things. But for our purposes tonight, we can say I would date it to something like the 2nd century to maybe the 6th century. There are other paradigms that would date it otherwise, but part of the beginning date of that is important for us because it's after the writings of the New Testament texts, right? So we're kind of picking up in this apostolic and post-apostolic period. There's a lot of production of Christian texts in this time after the composition of what will become the New Testament, and that's another important thing to note, is that the New Testament texts are not kind of canonized. We don't have an official canon list of the same 27 that we have in the New Testament today until the end of kind of late 4th century with Athanasius. There are several people who kind of propose different lists, right? But there are a lot of other texts that don't make the cut, don't make it into the canon, including things like the Shepherd of Hermas, which was a kind of visionary text, and the Acts of Perpetua and Felicity that were read out loud in churches, and we'll come to that in a little bit. Where that ends, where early Christianity ends, is also debatable, but we have the fall of the Roman Empire in the 5th century and a kind of decentralizing of, you could say, Roman government, but there's still the Eastern Empire, which considers itself Roman and Byzantium. So that's kind of where we're hanging out time-wise. Where is early Christianity? That's another big conversation, but we'll say for tonight, after the death of Jesus, his followers scatter, and this contributes to the spread of Christianity. These accounts are sometimes when I teach historical theology, there's a lot according to tradition, and which means that we don't have text, but there's a kind of received tradition around maybe who went where. But what we can say is that by the end of the 1st century, and certainly into the 2nd and 3rd century, there are established Christian communities in Mesopotamia, in Greece and Asia Minor, meaning modern-day Turkey, North Africa, particularly Egypt, but along the Mediterranean. According to tradition, Christianity reaches Ethiopia in the 1st century because of the Ethiopian eunuch. Also, according to tradition, Thomas goes to India in the 1st century, and then there's also Christian communities throughout parts of Western Europe, Southern Europe. So that's kind of where and when we are, but a thing to maybe even just in that little description, hopefully you're keeping in mind, is the incredible diversity of those contexts, right? We're talking about several centuries of time on multiple continents, and in major cities like Rome, Alexandria, Constantinople, these places that were really kind of metropolitan in their time and were places where major trade was happening. So you had numerous ships making cross-Mediterranean trips every year, right? So there's a lot of engagement between cultures and religions and so on, which makes it really fun to be a historian because there's a lot to do. So to this point, what are our sources for knowing about early Christianity? How do we know what we think we know about early Christianity? Well, there's scripture. And for the early Christian church, again, to the point about this like formation of the kind of canon of the New Testament, when we're reading those texts in the New Testament and there's reference to scripture, they're talking about the Hebrew scriptures, of course, and often things like the Psalms and the prophets, right? For the early Christian community in the first couple of centuries, that's still the primary scripture. There's the circulation of the letters of Paul. Some of the Gospels are also circulating, and as I said, there's these other texts I have listed here as Apocrypha that don't make the cut eventually when the canon is formed. But these are still influencing early Christianity and theology during those first few centuries and even beyond. Okay, Other Christian texts are being produced. Sermons are being not recorded, written down, recorded, of course. Sermons, letters are being circulated, theological treatises, things like saints' lives, liturgical texts, and obviously as time progresses, and especially after the legalization of Christianity, then more and more texts survive from that time because they're not being destroyed. The community has the kind of bandwidth to be producing and recording those texts. They eventually get increasing backing from the empire, and so that increases all of those kinds of things. And then there's evidence of Christianity in non-Christian sources. So, for example, like legislation, or here on the right-hand side is flushes out a little bit of the context there, but that papyrus strip, which I just have the detail of, is a receipt for sacrifice. So not for Christian sacrifice, but that somebody is proving that they've sacrificed to the cult of the empire, and that they're not going to be subject to persecution, right? And then all manner of also visual and material culture. So the earliest Christian art dates to about the 2nd century, late 2nd century, and there's a variety of reasons for why there's kind of this apparent delay in that production. But again, something we could take up a little bit later. All right, making sense? Great. So I'm going to... Oh, absolutely.
Can you help me with the scope of the sources? I mean, how were they in rural villages? You didn't have a printing press.
Yeah.
If we were to put them on the tables, how many tables would we have books on?
Oh, like you're thinking like what's the kind of amount, like the number of?
Well, that's one way of looking at it. Yeah.
Yeah, and the format.
Yeah, I mean, did the common person know about these?
Yeah.
How broad was it?
Right. Yeah. No, that's a great question. It's a great question. So the vast majority of people are illiterate at this time, and this is really based on class and like location too. I mean, just in terms of access, right? Being in a city versus being in a rural area, and it depends on your job. There are also you might think about like kind of degrees of literacy as we don't talk about literacy maybe as much publicly today, but there are still degrees of literacy. And we could also talk about textual literacy versus visual literacy. I would make a distinction with that too. So, and when we talk about, like when you're reading a historical source and they refer to themselves like a pre-modern source and they refer to literacy, it is usually meaning whether or not that person knows Latin. And that's in the West, in the East, it would be Greek as kind of the lingua franca, right? So there are vernacular languages that are developing, and so it's a question of like, people are really writing in Latin if they're in the West and Greek if they're in the East. And it's not until the later Middle Ages as you start to have more and more texts in the vernacular. And Dante writes a text actually called In Praise of the Vernacular, which he writes in Latin to make an argument for the vernacular, which is funny. But in this time, like where people are receiving theological information would be in sermons. So even, we know the churches are, again, it varies on location, all those kinds of things, but there are very large churches, especially like cathedrals by the, in the 4th century after the legalization of Christianity, and they can make their own spaces instead of adapting spaces. And so we know that especially for, major feasts and things like that, that there would be like there could be thousands of people accommodated in such places, right? And we know that, for example, with Augustine, who we have a lot of his sermons, and not all of them have even been translated into English yet after all this time, but that people were recording transcribing is what I mean, his sermons. So things are being preserved and could be circulated, but for somebody who can't read or write, they're still receiving biblical teaching. So it's much more an oral culture, right, where things are being read out loud. Or for example, in a monastery, when we have, Augustine also writes one of the first monastic rules and we start to have these communities of monks and nuns from around that time. And so oral reading of scripture during meals, of saints' lives during meals, things like that, is also just another way that information gets kind of circulated. I'll say one more thing, if I can, about the material part, which is that initially it's a papyrus scroll, and then the codex as a form, like the book, becomes increasingly popular really in the 4th century. And then with that, they start to use parchment in the West. So like calf skin or sheepskin, which is much more durable. Papyrus was a major export out of Egypt. And so for, say, Rome, they always had to pay kind of, they're importing it from Egypt. So it behooved them to switch technologies, basically. So that also has material impacts for how the information is circulated, things like that. Yeah.
Early Christian seems to have influences from multiple cultures. How would you say that Greek, Egyptian, or all these other cultures influenced it?
Did you see my next slide? That's a great segue. And there's lots of ways that the other cultures influenced it, and this is the thing also that scholars like debate about. But we can point to some pretty specific examples in early Christianity when we look to, let's see about going back, but I don't think I will. When we look to early Christian art, actually I will go back because I can just bop right there. So you might not be able to see it, and I promise this is not a plug for my book. But right here is an image of the Good Shepherd, okay, on the ceiling of this catacomb. And we have other images around. We know this is a Christian catacomb. This is an image of the 3 youths in the fiery furnace, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. Here's an image of a person in what we call the Aron's position with their arms up in prayer. And that's a pretty ubiquitous kind of position. It doesn't make something automatically Christian. It was a common pose of prayer. But the Good Shepherd I point to, or the shepherd, I should say, see, I already put that kind of Christian filter on it by saying Good Shepherd. The shepherd figure is one that's ubiquitous in the ancient world because it's an agrarian culture, right? And even before Jesus identifies himself as the Good Shepherd in what's known as John chapter 10, the shepherd already had this connotation as like a philanthropic figure. And so it was kind of, it could represent like the virtue of philanthropy, but it had other connotations like Orpheus, right? So there were other, Greco-Roman deities that had shepherding connotations that could be, when you have an image of Jesus as the Good Shepherd, it's not just then in the Mediterranean context an illustration of John 10, but it's also a part of this larger ancient, like you're saying, this Mediterranean culture where it's invoking ideas of like protection, guidance, discipline, things like that, right? So it's really, that's what's really great about art history and visual culture is that it can be really layered and complex. It also means that if you just encounter an image of the shepherd somewhere without any other information, we don't know. Is that supposed to be Orpheus? Is it Jesus? Is it, is it just a generic shepherd? We don't know if we don't have more of kind of visual information. Likewise, there's, we could draw parallels between depictions of early images of the Virgin Mary and Isis, the goddess Isis, So there are, if things aren't labeled, a divine breastfeeding mother kind of image can also be ambiguous, right? So there's these visual elements that are the things that come to mind to me first as an art historian. And for example, even with the 3 youths in the fiery furnace or images of the 3 magi coming to venerate Jesus, they're usually depicted in early Christianity in what we call a Phrygian cap, which basically looks like the Smurfs kind of folded over cap. And that was a way of signaling that they're from the East. It was kind of a shorthand to say that this person's from, not just out of town, but from the East, right? So there's a way where they're aware of other cultures and signaling them in certain ways too. Does that kind of get to your question? Okay. All right. So we'll go here, and I'll try to be brief. And we can always come back to some of these things, but I think I'll go through them pretty quickly, and then we can get to some of these sample stories. So exactly because of these temporal and geographic contexts that are varied, and you so nicely segued for me, early Christian ideas of the body were influenced by a variety of elements, and this is definitely not an exhaustive list. This is just a few. I'm kind of gesturing to some major things. So we'll say Scripture, again, here referring especially to the Hebrew Bible, but it depends on how late in this late antiquity context we're talking about. If we're in the 6th and 7th century, then we would bring in the New Testament scriptures as well. Something obviously that has a big impact on how people thought about the body then and now still is the creation narrative of Genesis, right? The description of these humans and their relationship to each other. Throughout the Hebrew Bible, we see various kinds of stories of sin, representations of communication that the body is a thing that can be defiled, it can be cleansed, it can be healed, it can be punished, right? And so there's these kind of frameworks for understanding or interpreting when something happens to a body, how do we make meaning of that, and what's kind of the understanding of that in relationship to the divine, to God. Another thing I'll say here is that there are Jewish midrashic texts that also influence, we know are like aware or circulated in some Christian contexts too. For example, in the Genesis Rabbah, there's some interpretation, or one interpretation of the creation narrative in which Adam and Eve were joined, basically kind of back to back, and then were cut in half and separated. So there's this kind of, and I hesitate to say more equal because it's still, in a very different context, but they had a single body that was split in two, and we see this in visual art into the Middle Ages, that idea of images of Adam and Eve, where Adam is laid out and Eve is just kind of sticking out of him, like a Y-shaped, and they're presented as very androgynous in those images. And so there's a kind of almost like, I would say androgynous representation at that point of unity before they're separated. It's really interesting. In the Middle Ages, we'll see in calendars and books of hours, the zodiac sign for Gemini, which is twins, is sometimes represented as Adam and Eve being like before being separated, right? So that's just a little fun fact. I said I would be quick though, didn't I? So Greek and Roman philosophy, medicine, and culture. This is a huge category. Many categories I've mushed together. But something to notice in particular is humoral medicine. You've maybe heard of the 4 humors, right? Which are blood, black bile, yellow bile, and phlegm. Delicious. But maybe if you have ever said like, oh, I feel kind of out of whack today or something like that, I would argue that's a bit of a holdover from humoral science, which goes back to antiquity. And the idea there is that there are these elements, and they're associated with different characteristics and temperament. So they could be, somebody can be melancholic if they have one element out of, in too much or whatever. And likewise, it was used to make gendered interpretations. So women were believed to be cold and moist or wet. They're always leaking, and they were I don't know, mushy. I'm trying to think of what the adjective would be for that. Shapeless. As this is a theological term. This is a robust theological term. Yeah, mushy. So and it predates. These ideas predate Christianity, but they're preserved into Christianity. So I have on the handout there, I mentioned Galen, Hippocrates, and Cyranous are 3 kind of major influential physicians in this time, and their texts continue to influence medicine even into the early modern period. Some of their views are rejected, but there's a you might even say a disturbing amount of influence in some of those aspects. especially around like the woman's role in reproduction, that she doesn't contribute anything, like literally anything, and is just a vessel. There's some of those kinds of ideas. Women were understood to be kind of failed men in that regard, and they were just like inverted. And this is why I'll give you more fun facts. The word vagina, which comes from the Latin vagina, just means sheath, right? So it's just a container. It's just the inverse of the phallus. So there are these ways. It's very complementarian, and this is before Christianity as well, that these ideas are already embedded, right? There's a lot of things that Christianity does, which we'll get to in the Acts of Paul and Thecla, that are controversial. Christianity is a scandal exactly because it upends a lot of the patriarchal aspects that were in place in Greco-Roman culture. Okay, patriarchy. I think I put an exclamation point after it because I thought it's more fun when you put an exclamation point after it. Patriarchy. So what we mean by that in this context is actually a kind of more codified structure, which is the Roman family or the Roman home is headed by a paterfamilias, is headed by a patriarch. And so women passed essentially from their father's home to their husband's home were viewed as property in this regard. In the Roman context, monogamous marriage was the norm, but so were affairs. The paterfamilias was it was not unexpected for him to have relationships with enslaved people in his household, with concubines, with prostitutes, and so on, and divorce was pretty easy to access. And actually, we know in the 1st century BCE, Augustus tried to regulate family issues and encourage marriage by limiting bachelors' inheritances. So in order to encourage people to be married, he limited what a bachelor could inherit, for example. And this was not for moral reasons about marriage, but to increase birth rates in the society. Okay, so asceticism is also something we're going to come to, so I'll say a bit about it here. It comes from the Greek word for training, so it's this idea of self-discipline. It is something that can be both physical and spiritual. And so again, it pre-exists Christianity. It has a different connotation, or is framed differently in Christianity, of course. But some late antique philosophers had already discouraged sex as a bodily and a rational thing, right? You kind of like lose your mind, you lose yourself, and so therefore, for a philosopher, maybe not such a good idea, right? You need to be in the rational, and so therefore, to be too embodied is not good. And there's this idea of leaving the physical, the embodied behind, and ideally ascending towards something that's more disembodied or spiritual, or if could think of Plotinus, if you're familiar with Plotinus or Neoplatonic philosophy, where is this idea that we're trying to ascend back to this one called the nous, but we don't need to go into that. That's pretty fun, though. We should talk about that some other time, maybe in the spring. Plotinus. Okay, so asceticism and virginity there I have kind of flipped because I thought virginity can kind of go under asceticism, but in the Roman context, one major example of virginity would be the Vestal Virgins, right? So this is like a civic, this is not so much a moral pursuit as a kind of civic and devotional pursuit or a religious pursuit, in the sense that for the well-being of the Roman Empire, these women would not, they would be elected to, they would be chosen to do this. And then they could get married later, like in their 30s. So it's a kind of a strange arrangement and very counter to the regular practice of kind of family life in Rome. There were severe punishments if anyone accosted or raped a Vestal Virgin, but likewise for them, if they kind of abandoned their vows, could be severely punished or executed, you know. And then mythology is another place where we see these influences. I've already mentioned a little bit about something like Orpheus, but Christians are explicitly likening Jesus to some of these pagan precedents as a way of making an argument that Christianity is the new religion, right? It's this new religion, new philosophy, and so they're using that existing vocabulary to make that assertion. And we get lots of kind of, you know, origin stories or stories about the relationship between the divine and human in mythology that Christianity is aware of. Okay, to our last section right there, this emerging Christian theology or thought. Paul. I mean, I'm not the person to talk to you about Paul. Our president is, Molly Marshall. She could talk to you about Paul. But a lot has been projected onto and into the writings of Paul, I would say. And we, he expresses some kind of ascetic, we might say, sentiments, or some discipline of the body kind of sentiments. But they're also, I think, in some ways kind of veiled when he talks about this kind of thorn in his flesh. We don't know what that means, but there's all this speculation. He wasn't writing that letter to us anyway, so I don't know. But, Paul has a lot of baggage, I will say. But we shouldn't abandon him. In early monasticism, in Christian monasticism, we have these, it starts in the deserts of Syria and Egypt in particular, hermits and small groups of folks. If you've heard of the sayings of the desert fathers and mothers, these are usually 5th and 6th century accounts of 3rd and 4th century Christian practice and sayings, right? So it's an oral tradition that gets written down later. Very interesting, not at all systematic, but really fascinating accounts. So we have these small communities of kind of early monasticism and practice, which includes ascetic practices. So especially of the body, of course, the fasting is really important in that case. And kind of what we would think of as like vows of chastity, vows of poverty. They're not quite codified in the way that they become later. But a thing to emphasize there is that this tradition is also very explicit that it's not just like mortification of the flesh. There are teachings in the sayings of the Desert Fathers and Mothers, for example, that if you're just fasting and you're not working on anything else, there's no point in fasting. The idea is that a whole human is working on these things in concert, or that they affect each other. I think we tend in the 21st century to think of like, oh, I have a body, but they would probably say, I am a body, right? Like I'm not separate. The spirit and the soul and the body affect each other for good or for bad. These things are connected. And so therefore the kind of ascetic practice needs to take that into account. Virginity is an aspect of this, but it's also, virginity is understood not simply as some kind of physical sexual status. There's also discussion of the virginity of the mind, for example. So again, that kind of holistic approach. Virginity also often coincided with martyrdom in early Christianity, and I won't say more about that because we'll come to it here in a minute. Augustine, also one that I just shouldn't put on there because it's such a big, oh, Augustine. He also gets blamed for a lot. There should just be a class on Paul and Augustine that just deals with all of the ways that they've been blamed for a lot of bad theology. But Augustine is somebody who was such a prolific writer and who was preaching for so long, who changed over his career. It's very, and people hardly read any of Augustine. So it's difficult to stake a claim about it. But we could say he had been a Manichaean, so he had dabbled in this kind of dualistic perspective, worldview, that saw the physical world as bad and the spiritual world as good, right? So having this like dualistic approach. And so in his rejection of that, in some ways he kind of like overcorrects and maybe also I'm not going to say he makes everything about Manichaeism because I just said people don't know enough about Augustine, so I'm not going to spout off about Augustine. But we'll say in the West, in Western Christianity, he's a major influence still to today, right? In Eastern Christianity, less so. His works didn't circulate as much, but still was known and is regarded as a saint in the East. Did you have a... Great.
I was just going to say that I had a colleague who wrote a essay article on Augustine, and I think it was on determinism or something like that, but it was titled, Can a Leopard Change Its Spots? And his basic argument was that Augustine was still Manichaean even after he left. So
yeah, it's like the lady doth protest too much kind of a thing. Yeah. That makes sense to me, but not being an Augustine scholar, I would say. So by way of I want to highlight some summary points here, and then I want to shift to some stories, which I realize now, I'll think about time-wise and maybe cut some of the stories. But these are my takeaways from the first half here. There was not a homogeneous concept of the body, exactly because Christianity was so diverse. It existed in all of these different contexts. It wasn't like there's one Christian perspective on the body, right? No. So we always, when students make a generalization about Christianity, I try to ask them, when and where are you talking about? Which Christianity? Which church? But the body was important. And there's, I'm not trying to gloss over things too. There was anxiety about the body. There was concern about things like maybe defilement or sins that occur in the body and things like that, right? Like they were wrestling with this in a variety of ways. From a kind of medicinal standpoint in the ancient world, and this continues into the Middle Ages, the body was understood to be dynamic and changeable, right? And this is the humoral medicine contributes to that as part of the reason why, that you can kind of bring things into balance or out of balance, but also because of the belief in miracles and in the spiritual, right? We have stories of, for example, a young Christian woman in the Roman Empire who didn't want to marry the pagan guy that she was betrothed to, and prays and grows a beard miraculously, and then she doesn't have to marry him, right? So it's like miracles happen. So there was more possibility, one might say. And again, that the body and the soul are not so separate, but they're understood to influence each other in a variety of ways. And vision is a big part of that. I didn't get into vision, but there's understanding of the eye that's called extramission, which is that the eye is this active probing organ, and not just this receiver of light. And so this is also a good and a bad thing. It matters what you look at, and you can, this is like the story of David and Bathsheba is perfect for this, because the sin is through vision, right? Through seeing something and then wanting it, this person. And then, of course, there's ideals and there's reality. So when we read a source, we always want to say, who wrote this? For what audience? If we're reading a saint's life and it was written 300 years after that saint lived, well, it's probably an ideal, and we might not have very much information, So to realize that, or even in a theological treatise, what somebody's writing about, we can't assume that was the practice, right? We have to pay attention to kind of the genre and all of those contextual kind of details. Okay? Okay. In thinking about my remaining time, I think what I'm going to do is I'm going to probably skip Paul and Tekla. But you should read the Acts of Paul and Tekla. It's great and strange. She baptizes herself in a pool of man-eating seals at one point, and then they're all killed by lightning. Not her, the seals. But we'll maybe go to the martyrdom of Perpetua and Felicity instead. This is a early 3rd century account. This is has anyone read or familiar with this text? Well, of course you have. This is great. I would also highly recommend this one. It's a very short account, and it was widely popular in early Christianity. It's interesting for us for several reasons, one of which most of the text was written by a woman, Perpetua. It's in her voice. We don't know if she physically wrote it or if she dictated it to someone, but it's in her voice. And it has several references to baptism. It also has an early example of someone praying on behalf of a person who has died already. So she intercedes on behalf of her brother who had died of a kind of tumor. And he gets better in these visions she has. But basically, it's the account of this group of Christians who are arrested for being Christians and are awaiting their trial and execution. And it focuses on 2 women in particular, Perpetua, who was an educated noblewoman, and Felicity, who is an enslaved woman, and then there are also some men who are mentioned. It's introduced by an unknown author who kind of prefaces the account. Also significant is that both women were mothers. So Felicity was 8 months pregnant when she was arrested, and she expresses concern that she would not be martyred. Like, she desires her martyrdom, in other words. She was concerned that her pregnancy would prevent her from being martyred, and so she prays to give birth early, and in fact does, and then is martyred. Felicity, on the other hand, has already given birth and has a baby that she's nursing, and basically works out, I think someone is bribed, to have the infant brought into the prison so she can nurse the baby until her execution. And there's a lot of discussion of her father, who is really upset about her being martyred and basically tries to tell her not to fess up to being a Christian. And she says, "You see that pot over there? Can you call it anything other than a pot?" And he says, "No." And she says, "You can't call me anything other than a Christian. I'm a Christian." And then he rips out his hair. So she has also a series of visions. And in one of them, which I have the excerpt in your handout there, I'll tell you the thing that she says when her baby comes, though, because I think it's very sweet. When they bring the baby to her, she says, "Immediately I became well, and I was relieved of the suffering and concern for my infant, and the prison immediately became for me a palace, so that I preferred to be there than anywhere," with her baby. But the night before her execution, she has a dream in which one of the deacons comes to the cell and kind of like brings her hurriedly to the arena. And then this is where the quote is. And so it starts there, "And I see and a certain Egyptian, ugly in appearance, along with his helpers, came out against me to do battle with me." And we'll see here further below, she interprets that as the devil. She says, "I realized because of this dream, I'm not fighting animals, I'm not fighting beasts, literally, but I'm fighting the devil." So here obviously is a racialized aspect where an Egyptian man is representing the devil in her vision, in her dream. And then contrasted with handsome youths who came to be her helpers and protectors. And this is the point I wanted to highlight. She says, and I have it in bold there, "And I was stripped and turned into a man. And my protectors began to rub me with oil like a wrestler. As they were accustomed in athletic competition, and opposite me, I saw the Egyptian rolling in the dust," which is also something that Roman fighters, wrestlers would do. You'd put oil on, and then you'd roll in the dust before you engaged in fighting. And so then there's this description, basically these kind of announcement, and then further down to the next bolded thing, she says, "I was lifted in the air, and I began to kick him as if I were not standing on the ground," which is really like a kind of Matrix type move, it feels like. And then I saw the fight dragging out. I joined my hands so that I put fingers against fingers, and I grabbed his head, and he fell on his face, and I stamped on his head. It gets quite violent, So, and then she wins, and she gets the palm frond, and the person kisses her and says, "Peace be with you." So, in other words, there is like these gendered kind of assumptions, right? Like, in order to battle in this way of like thinking that she's, and it's not a literal battle, right? She's understanding it as a spiritual battle against the devil. But she conceives of herself, or she sees in this vision that she becomes a man in order to fight in this way. Okay. So masculinity being kind of associated with victory and with violence. The next example here is the account of Mary of Egypt, who was a 4th or 5th century, late 4th, early 5th century saint. The excerpt that I have for you is from a 7th century Vita, or saint's life, that's said to have been written by someone known as Sophronius. And in it, so according to the Vita, Mary of Egypt she's kind of described as a prostitute, basically, who in the city has a kind of vision, and when she attempts to go into this church, and then flees to the desert, basically, and spends the remainder of her life. When this part of the story happens, she's an elderly woman, spends the rest of her life in the desert, like just alone as this ascetic. So the place where we're picking up here is where a monk known as Father Zosima is traveling through the desert and encounters her. So he says, at first he was confused. Oh, here, we'll start even at the first line. Zosima suddenly saw to the right of the hillock on which he stood the semblance of a human body. So a figure that didn't even seem to be human to him at first. At first he was confused, thinking he had beheld a vision of the devil, and even started with fear. But having guarded himself with the sign of the cross and banished all fear, he turned his gaze in that direction and in truth saw some form gliding southwards. It was naked, the skin dark as if burned up by the heat of the sun, the hair on its head as white as fleece and not long, just falling below its neck. He was so happy to see somebody because he'd been traveling for a while. He runs after the figure, and the figure flees from him. So he says, "Why do you run from an old man and a sinner? Slave of the true God, wait for me, whoever you are, in God's name. I tell you, for the love of God, for whose sake you are living in the desert." And then she turns and says, "Forgive me, I can't look at you, but throw me your cloak because I'm naked and I can't turn to you because I'm a woman." And so because she had been so isolated, she wasn't even really wearing clothing. And you see, as in the image here, and this is a later image, 12th century image, but depictions of Mary of Egypt present her in a very ascetic state, in an emaciated state, and usually in a kind of partially clothed state. So she might have a sash kind of over her shoulder. So in other words, she's received Zosima's cloak at this point. And then you can see lots of ribs, like her ribs are highly emphasized, and sometimes she's depicted as like not even having breasts visible, right? So in other words, she becomes in her physical form masculine, or at least it's a kind of androgynous appearance. So he would, one more thing I would say there is that there is also a racial aspect of this too. In this, it's an element where kind of race and masculinity, you could say, intersect, because she's perceived as being, at first he thinks like she's a devil, right? And that's associated with the darkness of her skin because of being in the sun, as it says in the text, right? So you have, again, a kind of like assumed demonization, literally, of race in that account. But also because she has spent so much time outside, which is not something that women were supposed to do so much. We have this kind of separation of spheres in public and private and in the wilderness and all those kinds of things, right? It's not an appropriate place for a woman to be alone in the wilderness. And so that plays into also the kind of like masculinization of her figure and of her story. Just as a side note, in the Orthodox Church, her Vita is read, her figure is celebrated and her Vita is read during Lent, which is a strange reading, pretty intense. Makes sense, yes, exactly, because you're literally, the idea of Lent, we're going into the desert, for this time. It's, interesting. I don't have an image for the next one, and I didn't include a passage either, but on the theme of becoming kind of more masculine, and I will say that if you remember that description of the humoral medicine and kind of these like patriarchal assumptions that women are kind of failed men, physically and speaking and otherwise, that to become more masculine is to become more perfect in the ancient world and in Christianity, right? And so I'm not, affirming that idea. That's what a lot of the historical contexts assert. And so that's why what we would call like a transmasculinity, as here in the figure of Mary of Egypt, is more acceptable than transfemininity. So it's more acceptable for a woman to become more masculine than a man to become more feminine, right? In the ancient world, in the medieval world, and again, I'm speaking broad brush strokes here, and so we always want to say, do you want to say back to me, when and where are you talking about, Jennifer? So we could be more specific. Because I would point to, in the Middle Ages, the feminization of Jesus in medieval devotion is really interesting, and devotion to the side wound of Jesus, his birth canal, and so it's not to say that there's no value in that, and obviously devotion to the Virgin Mary, which begins early on in Christianity, complicates that too, right? So, but one example, and this is a relatively common motif in saints' lives, is that of the transgender monk or saint, by which I mean that a person who is born female and then dresses and passes as male in a monastic context. And there are several saints' lives that follow this trajectory, and they have even a similar format. So there's almost a kind of genre, which we see a lot in saints' lives in general, is that it's like when you get like a spy novel at the airport or something like that. There's an understanding that there's going to be, you got to start right away in action, and there's certain things that are going to happen in the genre. Otherwise, it's not very good. Same with murder mysteries. So it's the same way with a saint's life. There needs to be, some kind of trial or these kinds of miracles and things that are associated. So for this particular motif, there's usually some kind of family crisis that sends the person into the monastery, and then there's usually some kind of conflict in that monastery, and then that person is outed for their birth-assigned sex in some way, and then there's some kind of resolution or reckoning in which that person is revealed to be blameless in whatever the problem was. That usually happens after their death. It's a kind of posthumous justice. So one example of this is the monk known as Saint Marinos, who was born female and named Mary. And after their mother died, their father wanted to join the monastery. And so Marinos requested to shave their head, dress as a man, take the name Marinos instead of Mary, and then accompany their father into the monastery, which they did. And they were received, very well, and were assumed to be a eunuch, in fact, which I haven't even talked about eunuchs, and we don't have time for, but that's another very interesting category in early Christianity as a kind of third gender. So the monks assume Marinos to be a eunuch, and then everything's fine until after St. Marinos' father dies, and Marinos is accused of impregnating the innkeeper's daughter in the local village by that innkeeper's daughter. And she identifies him. The text tells us that she had actually slept with a soldier and gotten pregnant, but she accuses Marinos of impregnating her and identifies Marinos as the young, attractive monk. And Marinos accepts the blame and says, "I have sinned as a man," right? It's a little word signaling there. And then Marinos lives in exile just outside of the walls of the monastery, just in the woods. And even accepts and raises the child of the innkeeper's daughter. And then 3 years later, he's welcomed back into the monastery with the child, and then the child also joins the monastery as a novice, and they live that way for some time until Marinos dies. And then in the preparation of the body for burial, the fellow monks realize that Marinos could not have done this, and in fact was blameless and even received that, and then did all these things and cared for the child and everything. And so then they kind of lament and repent for the way that they treated Marinos at that time. So it's really interesting because it's not a single account. There's several accounts like this, and we could say, is it quite an affirming story, or does it further kind of relegate and make other, in some way by making it an saints' lives do this, right? They don't always feel very accessible. So what is the role of that kind of story? I'm going to conclude, believe it or not. Is that okay time-wise? Do you have a question? Okay. All right, great. Because it's till 8 o'clock. Okay. I want to do one more example, and then would love to talk more. Because I've talked about this, it's more acceptable to become kind of more masculine, I want to end with a kind of counterpoint story, also of two saints, Sergius and Bacchus. And they are two 4th century figures. They were Roman soldiers, high-ranking Roman soldiers in the 4th century. And their story is recorded in a 5th century Greek text called the Passion of Sergius and Bacchus. And so they were soldiers for the Roman Empire, but they were outed as Christians when they refused to go into a temple and sacrifice to Jupiter. So as their punishment, they were forced to wear women's clothes and process publicly. And this was a kind of classic way of humiliating men in Roman society as a patriarchal kind of society, to make them dress as women. And so I've included in the handout also two quotes there for you with some highlights. So this is telling of the emperor's response, and so I didn't highlight or bold everything here, but so they're basically having their military dress removed. women's clothing placed on them, and thus they were to be paraded through the middle of the city to the palace, wearing heavy chains. But it didn't seem to bother them very much. When they were led into the middle of the marketplace, the saints sang and chanted together, "Yea, though we walk through the valley of the shadow of death, we will fear no evil, Lord." And this apostolic saying, "Denying ungodliness and worldly lust, you putting off the form of the old man, naked in faith, we rejoice in you, Lord. Because you have clothed us with the garment of salvation and have covered us with the robe of righteousness. As brides, you have decked us with women's gowns and joined us together for you through our confession." So instead, and this really pissed off the emperor, because instead of being humiliated, they, as you could see here, like are praying and celebrating being brides of Christ, and being clothed in the garment of salvation, right? This is kind of biblical language. And I will say, as a side note, in the Orthodox liturgy, when the deacons and the priests are vesting before the service, the prayers that they say, because they have certain prayers they say with every step of that, refer to the being dressed as a bride, right? So very Song of Songs type imagery there. Okay. So then they're sent to Syria, modern-day Syria, to be tried by a military commander, and then Bacchus was beaten to death. The next day, Bacchus' spirit appears to Sergius and encourages him to remain strong so they could be together forever. So Sergius is obviously very upset after Bacchus dies, and he says, "No longer, brother and fellow soldier, will we chant together. You have been unyoked from me and gone up to heaven, leaving me alone on earth without comfort." And then then Bacchus appears and encourages him to persist, right? He says, "Hurry then yourself, brother, through beautiful and perfect confession to pursue and obtain me when finishing the course. For the crown of justice for me is with you." Now, here I want to point to the scholarship of John Boswell. And this book is called Same-Sex Unions in Pre-Modern Europe. This came out, a long time ago, I think in the 80s or 90s. But I would highly recommend, and what's really, one of the things that's really valuable about it is that it has a pretty exhaustive appendix of texts that had not been translated largely before, and these are liturgical texts. So two things I'll say here by way of conclusion. One is something that Boswell does is analyze this icon and others like it. So we see here Sergius and Bacchus. This is a later icon, so post-dating their vita by a little bit. And you can see they're dressed as Roman soldiers. They have halos. They have the torque, the gold thing around their neck there. And then there's an image of Christ in the center, right, the halo. And they're each holding, it might be a little hard to see there, but they're each holding a cross. Kind of looks like even a processional cross. And what Boswell does is he compares these to wedding portraits, actually, that were common in Byzantium, and where you would have a similar format of the two people who are married, and then Christ up in the center is the kind of unifying element right here. So these are two, on the right-hand side, two wedding rings, and the one at the top has the people being married, and then Christ in the center. The one at the bottom, not so much room, but a nice double portrait facing with a little cross in the center where Christ is represented, right? And so he presents this in saying, like, this is an icon, but it's using this marriage iconography that's well established in the Byzantine tradition. Now, I'll say that I think Boswell is a very important scholar and is largely very well received, but there are always some people who would push back on his interpretations, we'll say. Something that, the last thing I'll do is I want to share one prayer. This is found in an 11th century liturgical text. And so he looked at tons and tons of liturgical texts that have prayers, and this is a translation issue and why some things are, folks will debate or take issue with some of the interpretation, because translation is always tricky, going from Greek to English and so on. But there's something that's known as a brother-making ceremony, or a spiritual brother-making ceremony, something like that, where there's a liturgical text, a liturgical ceremony in which two people vowed or made a pledge of union to each other. Now, of course, we don't know what those people meant by that, what they intended. We don't know. We have the liturgical text, and it literally will just have an N for name because it's fill in the blank, It's like whatever prayer book, you may have like that. So we don't have enough information to know, is this, like two people who've served in the military together and have a very strong bond and would die for each other and have taken an oath, right? Is it something that is romantic? Is it something that is, also to recall that we're looking at these things from a modern context. And so a modern American context where ideas of like, gender, relationship, all these kinds of things are so different. And so we can't project onto the past too much and have to realize like there might be other ways of expressing affection that we don't have access to now or we don't participate in now, right? But I will read you this little prayer. And I will say, he said something like 1/3 of the texts of these types of liturgies come right after the marriage liturgy, right? Like the traditional marriage liturgy, whatever that means, the standard marriage liturgy, right? So this is this kind of, he translates it here as office for same-sex union, but that's another interpretation. Okay, so this is what the priest is supposed to say. For as much as thou, O Lord and ruler, art merciful and loving, who didst establish humankind after thine image and likeness, who didst deem it meet that thy holy apostles, Philip and Bartholomew, be united, bound one unto the other, not by nature, but by faith in the Spirit. As thou didst find thy holy martyrs, Sergius and Bacchus, worthy to be united together, bless also thee thy servants, so-and-so and so-and-so, joined together, not by the bond of nature, but by the faith and in the mode of the Spirit, granting unto them peace and love and oneness of mind, cleanse from their hearts every stain and impurity, and vouchsafe unto them to love one another without hatred and without scandal all the days of their lives, with the aid of the Mother of God and all thy saints, for as much as all glory is thine. Amen. So I'll stop there and can I have questions?
Yes, we have time for questions.
Just coincidentally, today I was reading a number of essays from Sister Joan Chittister. You must be familiar with her. There's a chapter on disciples, and it was really like a screed, a feminist screed. I mean, she's been a sister for over 50 years, right? And a lot of her other articles about that, but she is about as feminist as I can think anyone else is, so you're certainly familiar with her.
Yeah.
I could see what she has been up against, because she's talking about the church as it is today, but not the historical background. And what comes to mind in your presentation here is how diverse this concept of the body, particularly women's body, has become over time. Because you started with Christianity, and of course there was no Catholic Church at that time, and then the Catholic Church emerged. But Christianity, the Protestants, and the 40,000 denominations we have today is so diverse, and that also the definition of women is diverse, and as it is reflected in the role of women within individual denominations.
Yes. Yeah, I mean, it remains very contextual, I would say.
Yeah. So, I mean, a lot of the philosophy, a lot of the theology that you've been talking about this evening is still influencing us today.
Absolutely.
And, okay. Yeah, interesting.
Yeah. Thank you.
What would this have been if we had had a matriarchy society? No, I mean, what was the influence of the fact that Jesus happened to grow up in a patriarchic society?
Yeah. I mean, that's such a good big what if. That is very hard to. Next question. No, but I think I would say that, we get, even in Western Christianity, I think there are glimpses of those kind of like counterpoints or something like that, and not always actually great examples, because I'm thinking of times where you have like empresses in the Byzantine Empire, or there are times where it's not, probably a thing to do, but this is just the historian me going like, oh, well, let's unpack like what is a patriarchal society and what makes something patriarchal, because that's one of those words we throw around a lot. What's that? The Amazons, right? Well, so exactly. So there's other, there's other cultures. We have, we know that there are like matriarchal societies in Africa, in the pre-modern world, and in the Americas, like Native American societies that don't. I mean, this is what freaked out colonizers so much, right? Was that they couldn't like project, they couldn't understand basically the operation of those societies, which is why they demolished them, right? Exactly. So I think, unfortunately, for the history of the West, it's just been so predominant that it's hard even to, even now, I think those assumptions are so embedded that even when we want to kind of untangle them, we're not even often aware of how much we've been formed by them. So, yeah. Yeah. That's why a global history is important, too. Yeah.
I'm very apologetic. I came late. I have to learn to actually read my emails.
Oh, me too.
7:30. I know it's at 7:30. Anyway, you very well may have touched upon this, but in terms of the pre-Christian era in Judaism in Greece, if I remember having taken a class many years ago, that there was a real difference in terms of the attitudes between the Jewish culture and the Greek culture as far as their bodies. Somebody was saying that in the biblical times the Hebrews would be covered up pretty much while the Greeks were running around half naked or something like that.
Yeah.
And again, as a young student, that caught my attention, but I don't know if you talked about that or not. Or the two cultures, and then we merged them with the church. So I don't know.
Yeah. Yeah.
I don't know what my question is, but anyway.
What's up with that? You can just end like that. Yes, I think I follow what you're saying. I mean, it's true, and actually, even between the Greeks and the Romans, they often get kind of lumped together because you have like, things to Alexander, like Hellenism spreads throughout the Mediterranean, right? And then the Roman Empire kind of rises and takes things over, but they're always like, they were so. They admired the Greeks so much that they, copied all their artwork and did all that kind of thing. So, but they were even, there were significant differences too between the way that, for example, how like Etruscan women kind of pre-Rome in a sense had more, were able to be more publicly kind of active than Greek women. And so there are some differences like that. The nudity thing, yeah, this is like where that shows up, I think a lot is like in things like the arena, like kind of entertainment ideas of athleticism, and you see this in your kind of like art history 101 as you get to later Greek art, where there's this interest in the capacity of the human, physical and otherwise, but it gets kind of represented in a physical, idealized way in portraiture, and that's what the Renaissance folks like Michelangelo are super interested in recovering, right? They're basically copying those statues when they get rediscovered in the 17th, 18th century. I mean, yeah, like the Jewish ideas of the body that are existing before Christianity and influencing Christianity, of course, are formed by their own contexts and the places that those communities and in diaspora have lived. So you also find influence. I mean, I would say, like, what comes to mind for me is just like the synagogue at Dura Europos in Syria, this 3rd century synagogue that was covered in the like meeting hall space, floor to ceiling in images. It was discovered in the early 20th century, and it has images of like, there's no images of God, of course, but like of Moses and images of the temple, things like that. And Moses is depicted as a man in Roman dress, So there's this kind of like, obviously as a community in diaspora that's like oriented like physically towards Jerusalem and towards where the temple was, but they are living in a culture, like they're in a Roman outpost there in what's now Syria. So there's still the visual kind of like translation of culture that happens. I think I'm just talking away from your question, but okay.
Can I ask a question?
Yes,
So
just one.
Okay. And if it's too like close to home or whatever, you can say, yeah, that's right. So obviously you have a tremendous amount of historical knowledge. You spend your time reading, thinking, engaging these texts, teaching about them, writing about them, etc. And they clearly, though, impinge on current realities.
Mm-hmm.
So, in terms of gender, sex, the conception of the body, or whatever, how do you navigate kind of the shifting sands of what you discover, read, learn, and how it helps you to think about or process what you experience? I mean, part of me was also thinking about this is so wonderful and interesting in part because you're Orthodox, right, which is a tradition that's typically would be viewed as more patriarchal.
Yeah.
Right. So is it? Can you share any thoughts in that regard, like how having this knowledge? And I know you're not alone. I've had.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah. No, that's a great question. Well, I think that something that I love about history is that even when things are like feel really foreign, that idea of like history is this foreign land kind of concept. I think even as when it feels really foreign and you read something like that just seems bizarre and you think, how could people think this at this time? Or, like those, like the medical ideas and stuff like that. Or the reason I'm a medievalist is really because I like the weird pictures, so some of those things seem strange. But also at the same time, they seem so familiar, I mean, there's so much about the past where you read, that line that I read of what Perpetua said about her being reunited with her baby and feeling like the prison was a palace because she was with her child. Like, that's so beautiful and also horrible because she's like kind of willingly going to her death, So I think things like that to me, I think it's probably partially my own aesthetic, which is also probably why I'm Orthodox, which is like there's something about the friction of the paradox of those things bumping up against next to each other, where it's like it's foreign and relatable, it's intimate and strange, and I think that when I teach and share this kind of thing, what I want to show my students, what I hope I can convince my students of, is that I'm not trying to sugarcoat anything about the past, right? Like, there were plenty of horrible things that happened, obviously, and that Christianity perpetuated, that organized religion perpetuated, all kinds of things. And as a historian, I know a lot about those. But at the same time, I think there's so much, because this is, it was experiences lived by individual people and in this variety of contexts like we've talked about, which means that there's also so much really rich material. And I think it's easy to kind of throw out the proverbial baby with the bathwater, and it's kind of easy to say, oh, people didn't know as well as we know now, which is also, we want to be careful when you start thinking like that. Because I also think we've just gotten more efficient at killing people, but that there's, the past may surprise you. I suppose that's the shortest way of saying it, which is that the past may surprise you, because it surprises me all the time, every time I study it. And when I can read something that was written, almost 2,000 years ago, and feel like I identify so closely with it, and then read the next sentence and think, what is she thinking? Like something like that, which is also relatable. So I think especially with, as a medievalist, my kind of plea is that the medieval and the modern, and we could say the late antique and the modern, are more intimately related than we often realize, in part because we're living in the kind of wake of those periods. And so those echoes kind of reverberate even when we're not aware. And that's, I think, a reason to try to understand and study the past. But also it can be really exciting. I mean, the easy example for this is when I teach like medieval women mystics, because there's like strange things there, and the students like get obsessed with Julian of Norwich and things like that. So I think that actually to speak to gender and sexuality in particular, I think there's a lot of assumptions about what the church, as if there's also a single church, but what, say, the Catholic Church, for example, taught and believed was not one single thing the whole time. And ideas of gender and sexuality, I think in some ways, exactly because of that humoral medicine and a real belief in miracles and transformation, that there was a more dynamic understanding of gender, what we now call gender and sexuality, than I think sometimes we allow for in our modern lives, because we have this kind of rigid post-Enlightenment idea of what the body is in some way. Yeah.
Hold on, we got a couple more here. Hold on.
I'm not trying to pin you to the wall or something, but when I hear Holy Trinity Orthodox Church, and then the answer you just give, I'm like, well, what about the Orthodox part of your beliefs? I'm sitting here at the meeting house, right?
Yeah.
And it's trying to figure out, how does this conversation relate to the community that gathers in the meeting house?
Yeah.
And the struggles, I'm 67, right? Trust me, when I started out, this is not how the church talked, right? And here we are, I'm sitting in a place where we're having this conversation. But what does Orthodox mean when you say Holy Trinity Orthodox, and the conversation you're teaching as an educator? Does the belief system embrace it, or is it a paradox? It's like, I like wrestling with this thing. I mean, can you make it just a hair more personal?
Yeah. Oh, absolutely. Because
Wrestling is here too.
yeah.
It's everywhere.
It's everywhere. It's
Yeah,
everywhere.
yeah.
Even when people think it's not, that's everywhere. No, because I realized as soon as you walked over there, I hadn't quite got to the last part of the question. So that's that gets me back there. I would say, I do like the struggle, I suppose. But part of the reason that I stay where I am, that I'm committed to where I am. No. But I actually get a judgy version of that question often. I know that's not what you're doing, and I appreciate that. But I think I also should account for it. I mean, actually, because of the things that I hold to be true and valuable and ethical. So I think it is worth accounting for. But again, I guess I'm always speaking as a historian, which is that the kind of irony or the tragedy, depending on how you look at it, is that these resources are in the tradition. So what makes me really sad in Orthodoxy and in other contexts is when the community is so unaware of its own history, so unaware of its own theology, and I'm looking at it and I'm saying, we have the resources already. It's not some modern projection, friends. Like, when you look at in the Orthodox tradition in particular, in part because it's just coming from a different philosophical tradition. So in the East, we often kind of say like, oh, there's more. We embrace mystery a lot, right? It has this kind of like the apophatic tradition and this what we call like kind of negative theology and kind of mystical theology, which I love for a variety of reasons. That can also be like a way of an out and not dealing with things also. But I think that actually in that tradition of mystical theology, apophatic or negative theology, however you want to call it, there is also a lot of resources for doing this kind of work. And I think that for doing constructive theology, actually, and I really don't want to dabble in constructive theology, because I'm like, ew, I want to stay in history. But I think that's what I try to do with my students too, is to show them like, if we want to, I think that Pseudo Dionysius in the 6th century should be a resource for somebody doing constructive, like affirming theology now, right? Because of constructions of like how he deals with language and what's known, and also personhood. So I think that there's just really, Bryce Rich is somebody who's Orthodox and has been publishing on these very resources in the Orthodox tradition. And Fordham University has been supporting those kinds of projects. There's a website called Public Orthodoxy that's been doing this. So there's actually, in the Orthodox tradition, some exciting conversations. It moves at a glacial pace because of the nature of the Orthodox Church. But there's also things like I mentioned that even in the liturgy itself, where the deacons and the priests are every Sunday talking about themselves as the bride of Christ and putting on this garment, and this is the wedding chamber. This, it's like, it's already there. And I think if we pay attention, it's really, really rich. So I'll stop there. Yeah.
Well, let's give a round. Thanks. Thank you so much, Dr. Freeman. Yes, absolutely. Just as a concluding remark, we will be sure to get the handout into the show notes for those of you who are watching on YouTube right now. Is that correct? Show notes, is that right? Or is that podcast language? That's probably podcast language. I've been listening to too many podcasts. This concludes actually our summer series of talks. So our next Faith and Justice event will be in October, on October 12th. It will be a panel which will feature several local scholars who will be coming together to talk about Dietrich Bonhoeffer. And it will be a luncheon panel. So I will ask you to sign up if you're interested in coming to the discussion in the morning and then staying for lunch together to continue the discussion. So I hope you'll consider doing that. Let me just say a quick blessing and we'll head out. Lord, we thank you for this night. We thank you for this presentation and all that has been put before us to think about, wrestle with. We think also about those who've come before and the ways that they wrestle with what it meant to be human and to try to live out their lives faithfully in this world, trying to follow after you. And we give thanks for that. We give thanks for their integrity and their attempt to walk truthfully in your way of love. Help us also to do that and discern what that looks like for us here and now. We ask and pray all these things in your name. Amen.